Good evening, everybody. Difficult to see you. One thing we wondered, and that's important, I won't do that all the time here. One thing we wondered is, how many of you have a background in philosophy? Wow, that's quite a lot. And who has a background in like neuroscience, neurobiology, that sort of thing? Wow.
Oh, that's pretty
Okay.
good.
It's more than we expected. Thanks. For the beginning, I think it would be nice to introduce these two people. Actually, they don't need me in order to talk. They could do that just by themselves and they would do a great job. But I think it would be nice for you maybe to know a little bit more about Siri and Vittorio. As you know, Siri is one of America's best and most acclaimed writers. However, she has at least two, and in reality many more sides to her soul. One is her interest in science, which makes her, at least in my eyes, to be one of the most brilliant essayists of our time, covering a range of topics from psychoanalysis to neuroscience and art and painting, architecture, philosophy. After finishing her dissertation, thanks Vittorio, Siri began writing prose, and as you know, she never stopped until today. Your next novel comes out, I think, at the beginning of next year already. March. So she's continuously writing. She just published a thick volume of essays, and she tackles very fundamental questions. What is the mind? What is reading? What is writing? She's a frequent guest at universities and contributes to the rare but truly interdisciplinary talks and dialogues between the humanities and natural sciences. She talks in front of psychoanalysts, philosophers. For example, she gave a keynote address at an international conference on Søren Kierkegaard in Copenhagen on the occasion of the philosopher's 200th birthday. She publishes in academic and scientific journals, including Contemporary Psychoanalysis, being a writer, Seizure, the European Journal of Epilepsy, Neuropsychoanalysis, Clinical Neuropsychology. So, in all these journals, you see she has at least two sides. Vittorio is neurologist, professor of physiology at the Department of Neuroscience at the University of Parma. And because that's not enough, he's professor in experimental aesthetics at the Institute of Philosophy, School of Advanced Study at the University of London. And because that's not enough, he's adjunct senior research scholar at the Department of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University. And he's here at the Einstein Foundation. He's a cognitive neuroscientist. His research focuses on the relationship between the sensory motor system and cognition, both in humans and in primates. And there are two important and major contributions by him, which, when you come from the field, you're familiar with, of course. One is the discovery, together with colleagues at the University of Parma, of the so-called mirror neurons. The other is what he called embodied simulation theory. We will talk about that, I think. A theory of social cognition which he developed over the years in a truly interdisciplinary conversation with lots of colleagues, which, to my eyes, makes him very special because he's a truly interdisciplinary scholar. I leave out all the prizes he got, more than 220-something papers he wrote. Presently, he's an Einstein visiting fellow and has a research project at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain. Now, thinking about how to start, and there are many questions we could start with, I thought it would be good to start with a very simple question. Here's a writer, there's a reader. Of course, the writer reads and the reader writes. So they have at least an idea of what the two kinds of perspectives are like. Now, the question I'm interested in is, what happens when you read? And is it the same that happens when you write? Maybe, Vittorio, you start with what happens when you read?
Well, there are several ways to answer your question. It depends on which level you decide to pick. When you read, of course, you move your eyes and you impress different parts of your retina as you move the eyes, moving from one letter to the next. And to make a long story short, there are specialized areas in the brain that have been studied extensively by French colleagues Dehaene and Cohen, prominently, who discovered an area in the back of our brain that through cultural evolution, this is very interesting, specialized in this reading activity. If you never learn how to read, this visual area deals with different stimuli, shapes, objects, but if you learn how to read, it gets specialized in reading. This is the most reductionist part of the story, because you not only process visual stimuli that you learn to recognize as letters that put in sequence form words, which in turn, in a syntactic arrangement, form sentences. These sentences are recognized as meaningful. They signify something. They refer to something in the outside world, or they refer to something happening in the inner being, into the soul of the individual, if the narrative deals with human beings. And then, it's when, from my point of view, it gets really interesting. How do we understand what we read, and why do we read novels in the first place? Why are we, since maybe from Gilgamesh onwards, so for thousands of years, we are so much fascinated, not by the real world, but a narrative of the real world? And this is something that applies also to images. We are storytellers and we are image makers. So it seems that we are not satisfied at all with the triviality of the physical world where we happen to live. We are constantly seeking to go beyond that by creating it, if we are an artist like Siri, or by exploiting the creativity of artists, if, like the two of us and the people sitting there, if we are readers. And this meaning is a manifold. I mean, there is the meaning of the words. The word signify refers to something. But this is the beginning of a series of concatenated events happening not just in our minds, but in our body. So we simulate the feelings of heat, the feeling of coldness, of being deserted, of being warmly loved by someone. And this happens in the whole body. So the reader put at the service of this specific aesthetic experience, not just the brain, but the whole body. Because if there is one thing I've learned about the brain, there are far more things I don't understand about the brain. But if there is one thing that I learned about the brain, is that you won't ever understand the brain if you sever the brain from the body. Yeah. And I'll stop here.
Does that mean that the quality of an artist's book, novel, is the way this book makes you feel certain things, come into certain states of your body? Is that what you would call quality?
Well, this is a very difficult question because there are different styles and different readers. So this is something we all realize talking to friends, members of our families. For example, I never managed to convince my wife to read Robert Musil, and she's a big reader. She reads Siri, she reads a variety of classic writers, but when it comes to der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, she stops.
Well,
what is my favorite?
But Musil never finished it either.
Yes.
There's something about the unfinished, but I think, and Vittorio would agree, that what we're talking about with writing and reading is an intersubjective reality, right? Art is a social act. It is necessarily a social act. So there's always two. The text is not, of course, a living being, but we are responding to the text as the trace, if you will, of a living human consciousness and unconsciousness. So the question about quality, you know, we can be moved by television commercials.
And bad ones too.
You know, and bad ones, exactly. So I think that can't be the single answer, right? But that we are bodily involved in the texts that we read that move us, that is absolutely true. And the other side of this, which is about writing, that I become very interested in, is that it is about movement. You know, there's a beautiful quote that I like to quote, and I'm quoting in the paper I'm giving tomorrow from Mandelstam, which goes something like this: I wonder how many sandals Dante wore out while he was writing the Divine Comedy. The act of writing is very much about a kind of gait, a kind of human walking and traveling, traveling in your mind. It is a motor sensory act.
So what happens to you or with you when you write?
There is a kind of, you know, loss of self. Many writers talk about this, that you enter the text. Now, the similarity between writing and reading is something that scientists have a hard time talking about, which is mental imagery. You know, what the heck is mental imagery? And, you know, it got so bad that during the behaviorist period, Watson claimed that people had no mental imagery. And there are some people on record who claim not to see images in their mind. Now, when you focus on those images, say we were just talking at the back of the room, I have a kind of mental image of the three of us standing there, what I was seeing, but the more I focus on the mental image, the more it disappears. But I know that when I'm creating a scene in a novel, I use usually actual spaces, just the way in artificial memory, in the classical period and the medieval period, you would use a room or a house to walk through and memorize your speech. And then actions take place in that. This has relevance to the hippocampus, which is now often thought about as part of the creation of scenes in memory, and I would say a kind of movement through the scenes, which has a motor component.
The relation between space and memory is pretty
Huge,
old.
Deep and old.
Old mnemotechnics
Yeah.
Systematically told people to arrange their memories, their events, like pretending to locate them in different places,
Yes.
in familiar places.
Including developing ideas by walking.
Yeah, yes. Walking is curiously a bodily activity that attracted systematically novel writers, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Balzac, there are Franz Walser, there are so many.
Virginia Woolf composed while walking, so that her sentences, and actually
Robert
when
was.
you read Woolf, you feel very much this rhythmic gait, speeding up and slowing down, but it echoes this bodily movement through space.
So that's one sensomotoric dimension of reading and writing. What about feelings? Anger, fear, hatred, all these things which come up, I guess, while you write and become a character or portray a character. So what happens with these?
Yeah, and where do they come from, those characters? That's another very interesting thing. You don't know. I mean, and I had this very angry character in my last published novel, The Blazing World. And suddenly, she's so angry. I had so much fun. You know, this is another thing about art that we have to ask ourselves. You know, it's the only time if someone comes up to me and says, you know, I read this novel you wrote, and you know, I burst into tears. You know, I was sobbing on my bed or on the bus or whatever. And I always feel, oh, good. But, you know, in life, you don't feel that. If someone said, you know, tells you, I was suffering yesterday and I cried for an hour, you feel terrible. So there's something about art that I think you were getting at earlier, Vittorio, which is that those feelings, those deep human feelings that we can experience in art are real feelings, but they're framed in another aesthetic context, which gives us, you know, what Aristotle used only once, that word only once, catharsis, that has something pleasurable even when it's painful.
Does framing in that context mean you're more able to control it?
Yes, you can close the book.
Yes. I think when we talk about these issues, we are forced to use definitions. And one of my favorite quote of one of my favorite Italian writers, Primo Levi, in The Drawn and the Saved, I sommersi e i salvati, speaks about the act of understanding. And what he says is that understanding is simplifying. So it's squeezing the huge, something that cannot be exactly translated into words unless through this act of abstraction, simplification. Understanding is simplifying, and in order to accomplish that, our species evolved two incredibly powerful tools, thought and language. So when we speak about the role of emotions, we speak about happiness, about anger, about surprise, about sadness, about fear. As neuroscientists, it's very tempting to look for a one-to-one mapping of these words into brain areas, brain circuits, the functioning, and to a certain degree this works because you need to simplify. Otherwise we are lost. So sometimes I'm asked, but how do you pretend to explain such complex things like aesthetics, asking questions to the brain? I say, well, we just want to start addressing some very specific issues, being fully aware that ours is an oversimplified version because there are so many variables at play that you must pick just a few of them, are in total control of those variables, and then through the results you generate new questions that foster, and you go on like music without an end, and that's the fun of it in a sense. I think there is a closer relationship between science and play. We learn how to live through play, and we learn a little more about who we are, asking questions to ourselves through the lens of science. I think I see a great parallel.
Absolutely.
I'm having fun doing
No, it's
science.
true. All of intellectual and artistic life is rooted in play. There's no question about that. And during the introduction, it was stated that this is very old. I mean, what we think of as art, which is museums and money and buying and selling, et cetera, this, of course, goes way back in human history. And I was so moved in Tübingen. There's a museum there, and they have the most amazing little animals that are all recognizable. There was a hedgehog this big, 40,000 years old. And then you ask yourself, there's an urge and a will in human beings to represent our world in some way. Right? There are, I know, elephants who make paintings and everything, but somehow this urge is more developed in the human species, in our species being. And that's extremely interesting. It's a desire to make.
Well, when you think about us being animals, there has to be one point in development in history, obviously, when we started to be different. Now, you said there are two important things coming into play. One is thought and one is language. Now, for some philosophers, that's the same. Of course,
I don't think so.
Yeah.
No, it's, I think, yeah, well.
Two things. Yeah. And in addition to that, there's probably a third component, which is beyond, besides emotion, which is consciousness. That's different from thought and language altogether. So could we pin down that a little bit more, what it is? Because when you said, obviously, we have this urge to
represent
and to form reality. I was thinking of my little experience with octopus in the Mediterranean. When you spot them, you can spot them because they build sort of little houses. They pile up little stones. And it looks very man-made, actually. Yeah. And they obviously have fun doing that. They enjoy themselves piling up these little stones. So a long time ago in history, there seems to be an urge to play in a certain way, which animals have.
They can even predict who's going to win in the World Championship.
That's right. No, but I mean,
good predictions, by the way.
Certainly all mammals play, and especially young mammals. But I think octopi play, and now there's some definitely there's research, and dogs also pretend fight. Right. If you've seen dogs together and they're not angry, but it's as if they have a theater of fighting.
So what's different with our playing? Any idea?
Yeah, we discussed that a little bit this morning during the conference at the Berlin School of Mind and Brain. All animals play. We do play. What makes human play different? And I think one key difference between humans and all other animals is our neotenic nature. Yeah. So we are born premature. So our brain, the size of our brain is very small when we are born, and it grows. But it doesn't grow in a bubble or in a vacuum. It grows among fostered, fed, cared for, this biological development through the human relationship, if we are lucky, that we can entertain with our parents, with our mother, with our adult peers, with our brothers and sisters. So brain development in the human species occurs during a very prolonged time within a social context.
Right.
We are the most neotenic species on Earth. And this explains a huge difference. If you compare I'm not an expert in genetics, but we are very similar to bonobos. I think we share more than 90% of our genetic endowment. And
which are the nicer apes? The others are the chimpanzees, which are more aggressive.
Yeah. Yes. So the idea is that this tiny difference is very important because this gene that back in time were considered to be junk genes because apparently they do not regulate the synthesis of proteins. This gene regulate the behavior of other genes. And some of these genes are specifically those that delay the development of our body and particularly of our brain. So having such a delayed and prolonged maturation, we literally feed our growing brain with social relations, with empathy, with affect, and this makes a huge difference. We depend on others. Cooperative behavior is not exclusive of our species. There are many scholars who claim that there are examples of altruistic behavior in other species, but this is very special.
There has to be, if you know,
There's
when
a
you're
video,
a mammal, you have to
There's
cooperate.
a very telling video shown by Mike Tomasello, who is in Leipzig, showing an adult human playing with a child. They are bouncing a ball over a blanket, and they are both having fun. All of a sudden, the adult releases the grip, so the blanket falls on the ground, and the child is frozen and then picks it up and gives it to the adult to keep on playing. You do the same with the bonobo. The bonobo leaves the room, and it's not a big deal. So this tells you the difference. We depend on others. We are social creatures to the utmost level possible, I think. Or better, our sociality is crucial for the development of our own individuality. There's no self without the other.
That's right. So it's co-constituted realities, right? This is, I think, very important, and more than in other mammals, more than in other animals. I mean, I just remember once seeing a foal being born. And, you know, it's an amazing thing, birth. And there comes the foal out of its mother, and a couple of minutes later, the animal, you know, is up on its legs and beginning to walk around. The mother is licking, you know, away the amniotic fluid. But that animal is often running in ways that the human infant, of course, will die. And we also know about, you know, terrible things. The infant that is fed but not touched can fail to thrive and die, fail to grow. And that goes on over time. So we are more dependent on others. And I do think art comes out of that dependence and interdependence.
If the social binding doesn't work, all the cognitive abilities are lost.
Yes.
We know that. What about what Michael Tomasello, whom you mentioned, calls the bird's perspective? Because, you know, he has these experiments where little children, age 3, play with young chimpanzees, a bit older than 3 usually. And up to a certain age, they have similar abilities in interaction.
Right.
But then what makes the most difference, the main difference between chimpanzees and humans is the ability of humans to take on a bird's perspective, which is seeing themselves interact with others and seeing objects in relation to others. So how does that come in? Would you say that's you know, what they call an emergent quality of the brain, or is that something inherent in the brain, or is it not just in the brain, but where then?
Well, self-recognition, the mirror test, the Gallup mirror test, very few animals pass it. In your
Elephants.
book, you describe the elephant,
Dolphins,
dolphins,
birds. I mean, there are a number. I mean, the numbers are growing, and of course, we don't exactly know what it means, but there has to be some level of reflective self-consciousness in order to remove that red tape, to be able to recognize yourself as an other.
Which chimpanzees do.
Yes.
They recognize
Which they do.
that.
So it's primates, and they thought for a long time it was only primates, but I think pigeons can do it too. So, What does it mean?
The point I was
Yes.
going to make was that this is not enough to explain the difference. So the usual
Exactly.
answer, which is begging the question, would be because we have language. So through language, you can play all these sort of games, like dividing yourself, being an I and being a me, which most likely a chimpanzee cannot do, just because he lacks the cognitive resources. And these resources probably are brought along, are a side effect of a byproduct of language. So we are the most asymmetric creature on Earth, to use an image used by Helmut Plessner. So we are asymmetrically positioned. We are naturally artificial and artificially natural. When we speak of landscape, nature, if you go to Tuscany, there's nothing more artificial than the landscape in Tuscany. It has been all man-made. Europe was covered with forest. We eradicated the trees, we changed everything. So whatever we take to be natural is the outcome of our constant, endless, fatigueless attempt to leave a stamp, I would say.
No. So think about the nature of saying I. You were saying I and me. So the embodied I is speaking. I mean, pronouns have fascinated me forever, right? So what is the nature of the I? Why do children learn it so late? Because it's a shifter in linguistics, right? You can say it, I can say it. A 2-year-old is going to have trouble with that because the I keeps moving. But the very act of saying I, or saying, you're a child saying its name, is a form of alienation in language, right? You're alienating the self from the self in a way that a rat that has consciousness, that is awake and aware and has memory and can navigate and do all kinds of things that we do. But I do think that act of alienation in language gives us a cognitive mobility, which is linked also to autobiographical memory, not to ordinary forms of memory. Like a dog remembers when he or she returns to a place. But that sense of mobility, remembering oneself as an other in the past, being able to catapult yourself into the future, right? And, of course, becoming an other in fiction. These are related acts. They are not separate. So the fact that I can imagine myself, next week or as a dying old woman in a nursing home is powerfully related to acts of fiction, the same way that, of course, we are not recovering the past in any identical way. We are recovering some version of the past that is influenced by the present, what Freud famously called Nachträglichkeit.
Okay, so let's open that chapter. It's a new chapter in our discussion. The relation between fiction and reality. In my
small question.
A small chapter. in my eyes, lately means, let's say, during the last 3 years, 4 years, there is a stronger tendency to underline that there is no clear division between reality and fiction. In fact, as one of the German sociologists right now, Jens Beckert, who just wrote a book about that, says, in order to plan at all, we need imaginary futures, a fictional not just ideas, but prognosis of what will happen. And this prognosis of what will happen in the future determines how we act today. And it determines in reality, not just fictitious, but in reality, how we act today. So what do you think is the relation between fiction and reality, especially when you, may I just add that, think about the political implications? Because it's nice to say we need fiction in order to live better in this world. It's not so nice to say we need alternative facts, which are fictitious, to live in the world in a better way. Now, there is a close link between alternative facts and fiction. And I think in politics now, this has been observed. I don't know if it has been observed intentionally by Trump and his people and others in the right-wing movement, but at least they're very good in making their use out of this connection. So again, I stop. The connection between fiction and reality.
Wow. Well, okay. So the fact is, you know, I am a neo-Kantian to the degree that I think getting to das Ding an sich, right, is not fully possible. We are limited by our capacities, by our species being. Huh? There are ways in science of setting up experiments and determining. I'm all for the scientific method. This is not some solipsistic excursion that I'm going on. But fiction or the imaginary is hugely important. You were pointing out about needing a future in order to occupy or inhabit the present, which, you know, picks up on Husserl's idea of time consciousness. You know, we're never just here. The now is not a point in time. We are always in a dynamic movement. And that, you know, the future is fiction by its very nature. If you step into the future, it's no longer the future. It is a fiction. So we are imbued with fictions, not to speak of cultural narratives, that we all inhabit in multiple ways, right? The fairy tale, you know, the wedding, love affairs. I mean, these are highly scripted in different ways in different cultures. Now, I was going to say fun facts. The false.
Sometimes it's fun facts too.
The fun facts that are pouring out of, you know, the malignant narcissist who currently occupies the White House in the United States is of course that we have a collective consensus about what's true. We know what lying is. You know, when the current malignant narcissist who occupies the White House said that he had the biggest inauguration ceremony in the history of the presidency, there were aerial photographs that showed that this was simply not true. We can all agree on them. They were not doctored, right? So that becomes scary. But I think the interesting question to ask, so that I don't have to answer this whole question, is how does it work? I mean, Vittorio is, I think, deeply interested in this, as am I. This is connected to human emotional realities. It is not just people who suffer from the DTs, as I like to say, the Donald Trump illness. It's all human beings.
Yeah, I mean, before we were discussing fiction and the impact that fiction narratives, broadly speaking, film narratives, literary narratives, image narratives, the impact it has on beholders, readers, and the like. And for many years, people claimed that the emotions we get when being immersed in this narrative were defined as quasi-emotions.
Drove me crazy.
Yes, me too. Now we can challenge this view and say it's false. Period. These are real emotions. As Siri was saying before, there's a lot of top-down control. So a genuine emotion that we get by reading a novel can be even more amplified than an emotion that we may get in real life in being involved in a similar situation.
Same situation.
But a Siri with a very beautiful synthesis, we can close the book. We can turn off the TV set. We can get up and walk out from the theater or from the cinema. So we can switch it off, what we can't do in reality. That said, what we have learned in the last 30 years or something is that this supposedly sharp dividing line between what is real, what I can touch, and what I can imagine is much more porous and permeable and less sharp than we would have thought. We put in action almost all of the same brain networks when we see something, but also when we imagine something. This morning, this early afternoon, I was showing a picture from an empirical work done by the group of Peter Thier in Tübingen, where they compared the responsiveness of mirror neurons when you witness an action being performed by an agent sitting in front with respect to a situation where the action is projected on a bidimensional computer screen. Half of the neuron behave in the same way. The remaining half prefer the action being performed live, but they still significantly respond to the bidimensional representation of the action.
If I may interrupt, that means what I see in the internet is as real as what I see in reality, so-called reality.
With a small caveat.
Yes.
Yes, with a small caveat. Yeah.
It's the phenomenal quality of the experience of witnessing a crime with respect to witnessing the same crime as a part of a filmic narrative is completely different, of course. But that doesn't imply that we are not moved in a very similar way, activating part of the same brain resources. So if there is a fire on the screen, we don't leave the movie theater screaming fire, fire.
Which happened when the first films were shown. That, you know, the train coming,
yes,
that famous
yes,
example,
yeah.
people were running out of the movie theater.
That's disputed. There are people
I think
claiming that
it's actually a little, that may be an apocryphal story. At least I've read some text about that. But you can understand how overwhelming a filmic experience would be if you had never seen a film before. But the interesting thing is that is about framing. That is a cognitive understanding, just as when you're reading a book, that a character that you came to love dies, and you may weep over the page, but you know that you don't have to arrange that character's funeral. Right? I mean, these are important distinctions, but they're cognitive distinctions. They're not about, in a way, the emotional pull.
But I've talked to writers who say they sometimes prefer their imaginary characters. And the feeling is that the characters they write about are as real people in their world. And then, even though I close the book, sometimes there are characters which follow me into my dreams. They follow into my actions. So maybe it's not true that I can simply close the book and that's it.
Well, you know, this is a little side point, but I've often thought about what is the difference between a novelist who has, say, I mean, I had 19 different narrators in my last novel, and I often thought about it as the multiple personality disorder book, because, you know, I didn't, I would go into the voice. I think actors do this routinely, but, you know, there were these different people, and I would have to feel them again. This afternoon, there was a lecture about emotional contagion and physiological signs that can be different in people with what is now called dissociated identity disorder. And I always thought someone should see if the physiological signs in a writer change depending on which character is speaking. It might be very hard to set up that experiment. Nevertheless, I think we like to think of the human being as a singular ego, and I think we are all inhabited by multitudes. And what is the difference between having dissociative identity disorder and being a novelist? Well,
you finished the book.
You finished the book and you recognize that it is a book. But I think you're drawing on aspects of self and other that are part of all of us and in some cases become pathological.
Now, in the title of our talk tonight, there's one word missing, the fourth word, which is politics. We talked about the effects that fiction has on our emotions. Now, I can use that in politics, political framing, as you know, and you just said basically that by using certain words, there are only certain options which we have to act.
Yeah.
So I frame very much the action by choosing the word. And that's not just linguistically, it's a framing in terms of pragmatics, what I will do. Now that's a very, it can be a good, but it also can be a dangerous political concept.
Definitely. My friend George Lakoff, since ages, is trying to lecture the Democratic Party in the United States about the relevance of linguistic metaphors, the enormous emotional impact that linguistic metaphors have on people. And he failed. Otherwise, we wouldn't have Trump sitting in the White House. When he claims, don't think of an elephant, he was tweeting desperately during the political campaign, telling people, don't relaunch the tweets of Trump. The more you blame them, the more you talk about it, the more it grows. That's right. Exactly the impact he was expecting
Never
that he got.
Repeat. And the American press has not learned this. They endlessly repeat what has been tweeted. They do it over and over again. The discourse just is an engine of propaganda for racism, misogyny, and xenophobia. Lakoff has an interesting idea that what the right does is uses the idea of the strict father family. I would take it down another notch to the body itself. If you listen to the rhetoric coming out of the White House, you will see that it's very much about the white male body being penetrated by brown and feminine pollutants. Seal the border. And the current president is a germaphobe. He has made remarks about menstruation, alluded to menstruation. So I think that the real fear, the real working metaphor is not the strict dad family, but the terror of invasion of the borders of the body, which takes us into the political arena of what I call the self-made man, and the self-made man is very much an American myth.
Would you say then that the weakness of the left is that they...
The left?
That they were not the left. The weakness of the left, exactly, is that they...
Where is the left?
That they failed to invent a paradigm, a fiction.
Well, I think the fiction, you know, these are very powerful fictions, right? This is a very powerful metaphor. The great book that I have continually returned to is Purity and Danger by Mary Douglas, where an anthropologist, and she talks about how pollution is coded in various cultures and how all the borders that are erected in any given society go back to the body, and that all fluids and substances that pass the border of the body are inherently dangerous. And Trump has found the alarm, the hysteria, in a country that is changing, where the demographics are changing. Many more brown people, women are now in fields that they were never in before. They're graduating from college at higher rates than men, and so this has caused alarm and backlash and terror of invasion. I mean, build a wall. This is a metaphor. It's completely a metaphorical fiction. Huh?
I think there are many big issues at stake, and we talk very little about that in the public discourse. I mean, there's a lot of debate about the euro, about the European Union, about how to face the demographic challenge that will hit us in the coming years, even more than it has done so far. But I think one key issue we don't discuss enough is the basic one. What is reality? What is our reality made of?
Yeah.
What do we rely on when we think we know the world we live in?
Yeah.
This is crucial.
Yeah.
If you link that with what we were discussing before, the idea that is fairly well proven that we are not fully rational at all. No. I mean, a couple of guys got the Nobel Prize showing that we are not so rational as we pretended to be. Much of what's going on is in the back of our consciousness. Much of what is going on influencing our preferences, our political choices, are these seeds instilled day by day by a very well-crafted use of linguistic metaphors, as we were saying before, studied by many people. Everything is out there. The only thing is that someone should bother to connect the point, and the pattern that would emerge is that we are living more and more in a reality which is totally manufactured. I think in a way it all began with Orson Welles. Orson Welles
that's right, you're right.
Was the first to, in a way, contaminate a medium at a specific time of the day when you would expect someone to tell you what's really going on. He said, well, Mars attacks and people were flooding in the streets screaming. So for the first time, you experience a sort of divergence between the differential nature of what the medium should convey and the falseness of the message.
It was a genre framing.
There was a joke, there was
absolutely.
an artwork, as a kind of surrealist act.
And
but we have it
absolutely
on a daily basis.
Now we have it on a daily basis that's, multiplied because of the nature of the technology. But you were broaching the subject earlier of, a very hot topic at the moment, which is the predictive brain, right? That one of the essential functions of brain processes is to predict. But prediction is also inherently prejudicial, right? That is the nature of the prediction. And this goes to a huge problem for all of us, Europeans and Americans alike, which is, of course, stereotyping. Racism, but also women. I mean, I like to use the example I used in an essay. It's just fiction. But there are two people. It could be two men or a woman and a man or two women, and they're looking across the room and they see the most beautiful young woman in a low-cut dress, gorgeous breasts, drinking champagne. And one of them says to the other, "You mean that gorgeous girl over there is working on her second postdoc in molecular biology at Rockefeller?" Now, we are always typing people. We don't do that to men in the same way we do it to women. And the reason I use the two people of any sex is because that's part of the typing. And in the United States, racism is living on these often very old stereotypes that are just churning away. And the right wing is constantly using them.
But didn't in a certain way brain research help this development? Why? Because for some time in brain research, the theory was there is no reality. It's all a construction of the brain.
Illusion. Right.
So why bother about reality? We have to understand how our brain is constructed, and then we know how reality is constructed. Now, if I were a right-wing politician, that would help my point of view, of course, because it would eliminate reality. That's exactly opposite to what you just said.
No, I disagree. I mean, science, broadly speaking, is always a double-edged sword. I mean, you can use the result to manipulate people, to harm people, but at the same time, I like to see the relevance of cognitive neuroscience, and in this second aspect, it can reveal the rule of the game. I mean, it can reveal how powerful is a certain discourse framed in a certain way. It can reveal how powerful is a very simple message that appeal to the simplest gut feelings of the people. It reveals how desperately we are, as human beings, seeking an identitarian status. And this identitarian status can take many different forms. So I'm not particularly fond of plot theories. Actually, I think most of them are. So I think it's a combination. There are times in history where there are economical situations, political situations. There is a constellation of facts that combine together make it easier for certain ideas to gain momentum. And I think the scary part of what I'm about to say is that I have the perception that now we are living this moment, and very few people are realizing that we should do something. And this something seen, I'm not a politician, I'm not an entrepreneur, I am a mechanic of the brain. So I have very little to suggest in terms of economical policy. The only thing, being an academic, that I think we should have more situation like this debate that we are having tonight. I mean, we should talk to the people in a very not easy way, because we are not going anywhere proposing easy solution to complex problems. No. But we should talk about these complex issues that have an incredible impact on our daily life, bringing in, making available for the people who pay us, because we live on public money. Right. In Italy, very little, but still public money.
No, but I also,
Okay?
I mean, I think...
So it's
yes.
part with this emphasis on definition, what in my country is designated as third mission. So the first mission is to teach people, the second mission is to do research, the third mission is to bring to the people, to the citizen, paying taxes, tell them why it's worth keeping paying taxes to support education, research, and academia. And we don't do it enough, I think. We are all captured by this publish or perish delirium. We publish papers that nobody reads. We are constantly forced, and this is also something, I'm sure you would agree with this, science on steroids, where the competition, which is typical, not estrogen fed, but testosterone fed, whose H index is the longest.
This is the biggest, the highest. I mean, I didn't know about that, but now I know.
This is bullshit.
It was, it's terrible. But you were the one who got me on ResearchGate, which is a kind of wonderful thing where you can share papers and you'll get your weekly rating, and they'll say, Siri, you have 2 new readers, 2. I go, yay! I hope they're really smart people. So that's the difference between novels and science papers, maybe. But I also think just the last, maybe, political comment is the role of shame and humiliation in not just European and American politics, but if you look around the world, the divide between rural and urban places, and the feeling, I mean, shame must be one of the worst feelings in the world. We all know what that feels like. And I think that a lot of these politics are being driven by mostly, but not entirely, masculine shame. The sense of being undermined, of feeling your importance slapped down. Whiteness in America has been automatically given a significance that angry white people are feeling has been taken away. Now, I think that's awful. I mean, I am, on the other side, but the feelings are real. The feelings are real, and that is why you see people marching in Charlottesville screaming, "You will not replace us."
But isn't that the bad side? Because you all know about the experiments, with attributing values to black and white, and then you reverse it, and you have problems. Even black people have problems attributing white values in the correct way. White is good, black is bad, and then you reverse it. And you can measure that there is hesitation, so you need cognitive input.
Right.
That's why we should tell people that race is nonsense. There's nothing like race.
Right.
In Italy, in 1938, we promulgated racial laws that were supported by the scientific community.
Yes.
We had a journal, The Defense of the Race, La Difesa della Razza, on the cover with the profile of the distinguished Roman profile taken from a marble statue. Then you had the caricature of the Jew and the caricature of the African Negro. Okay? And these were scientists, biologists, colleagues of ours. In 1938. Not a long time ago.
No.
So I'm not asking the television to have in prime time Channel 1 lectures on, but there are many ways in which these things can be brought at the level of public discourse.
That's
and
right.
I think we need to do it. Otherwise, we are lost, because the amygdala the gut feeling is much more powerful than rationalization. And one of the big failures in my country of the left is to believe that by showing figures, prospect,
yes.
It will help people to understand that what the right is claiming is nonsense. It doesn't work like that.
That's right. So the
it doesn't work
emphasis
like that.
on
and
emotion.
It's not working like
Absolutely.
that.
And
we see it.
So race is a fiction made real by history. These are the important things. And it's true that there's nothing like delving into the history of science, for better and for worse, to understand the ideological uses of science. And it continues to this day. I mean, if I read another thing about, an fMRI study that is explaining that, women have more double hemisphere action, which makes them more intuitive. I mean, I think I'm going to kill someone.
These are the things that drive nuts my wife.
I mean, it's
sometimes
stupid.
when I want to have an argument,
and you look at the study, it's just stupid. But this goes on and on, evolutionary psychology, the waist-hip ratio. Come on. All you have to do is go back into the 19th century, you'll find exactly the same kind of thing. Lombroso, who fascinates me, by the way, and was a very learned and intelligent man. But, criminality, women are atavistic, and, the great Paul Broca, great scientist, great neurologist, busy measuring female brains to show that, we're intellectually inferior.
Because, as Vittorio said, this is a public conversation or discussion. Are there any questions you have? I think we have a mic. Just a second. Oh, I'll give you. Okay. I don't have a mic anymore.
It's okay. It's okay.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I liked the beginning very much about plasticity and culture, and also about the self and the narratives that builds the self. That could be the difference between a chimpanzee looking at its image and putting a mark from its forehead. And I would like to hear more of this stuff. I mean, if you want to do, this political stuff. If you want to do a analysis of politics, you can't play the good guy, bad guy. I'm good and they are bad, and so this is so primitive. So I really would like to go back to the first subjects, and would be very interesting to hear what you would say about narrative and self. Would be a very interesting theme for me, and maybe we skip the good guy, bad guy.
So the interesting thing is, right, nobody has a definition, actually, of narrative. There's no consensual definition. Once you start thinking about it, it becomes more and more complicated. So most narrative theorists are, agreeing that you have to have an agent, right? And then there are events that are temporal, they're taking place in time. The roots of narrative are not really known. We know that every human culture tells stories. I don't think anyone has found a non-storytelling culture. And then your question, which I think is fascinating, to what degree do these narratives constitute what we think of as the self? Hume, was saying, there is no such thing as a self. It's just like these little loose fragments, and when I try to remember, there's nothing there. I would say that narrative does not constitute what is sometimes called a pre-personal sense of selfness, what a rat has. Even Freud said, just by dint of an animal's musculature, it knows something about where it begins and ends and how it's moving in space. There is a sense of self. Now, the narrative self is on top of that, and I would connect it to both autobiographical memory and the ability to project ourselves into the future, something that a child gains over time with social emotions, you know, pride. This is around 3. But it's rooted, as Vittorio knows, I believe this is rooted in motor, our motor reality, walking, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, there are several scholars that more and more. So what we are facing is a growing momentum of an account of culture, cultural development, and cultural evolution seen from the perspective of performance, the performative nature of culture that connects tool making, telling stories, developing narratives in a combination of action, performativity, memory, and imagination. Another thing that is coming more and more out of empirical research in neuroscience is how closely intertwined are memory and imagination. We tend to think that memory is a kind of figuratively a variety of drawers where we storage past events that eventually can be retrieved, recovered through some kind of effort or effortlessly if there is a strong emotional trigger. Or, on the other hand, this strong emotional trigger can keep at bay those memory and repressing them. Now we understand that memory and imagination, again, these are linguistic categories that for many years, I think, also played a role in guiding the questions to be answered by empirical research. You never exit the linguistic loop. So, but we must force ourselves to see things possibly not outside language because it's impossible, but to realize that linguistic categories are just words. And our phenomenal experience, there are 2 keywords for me, relation and experience. So experience is always constantly exceeding the words that we normally employ to conceptualizing. So coming back to your question, nobody has an answer, of course, to this question, but there's a guy sitting here, Michele Cometa, will give a talk tomorrow, who wrote a book, Why Stories Help Us Living, the necessary literature, and in his book he presents an evolutionary scenario that looks very plausible to me, namely that people invented story even before they had the words to express them. And this is probably linked to the performativity attached to the development of technological skills. And Lambros Malafouris today gave a very interesting talk about the relationship between making pottery and what art really means. So I think we are living, by all means, in a very exciting time.
Yes.
For the good and the bad. I like to see the half full glass, as we say, bicchiere mezzo pieno, and we are in a very exciting time of scientific discovery, but more than that, of the capacity to understand the relevance of some of this scientific discovery to better understand who we are and where we possibly will go.
And just the last thing about narrative, Paul Ricoeur, the great theorist of narrative, if you think about his 3 levels of mimesis, 1, 2, and 3, he does have this argument about human action and storytelling, which is part of the first level of mimesis. And I'm always interested in yoking things together, but I think this works very nicely with later notions and what Cometa has been working on. These are, it's the same insight. Yeah. No.
Yes.
Go ahead, shout.
Yeah. So my question is, if conflict is coming from the inability to understand the narrative of the other, what good are we making by analyzing the right using the left narrative? How can you fight racism without understanding it? And can you ever understand something without living it by yourself?
Right. No, this is, of course, an question, which is why I tried to make this point about shame and humiliation, these profound emotions as guiding emotions. I have a friend who's a sociologist, but he does a lot of field work, and one of the things he did was he wrote a book called Angry White Men. And he went around the United States interviewing angry white men. He happens to be a Jew, and he told everybody that he was a Jew, he was not incognito, and he got these people's testimonies. And his name is Michael Kimmel, and in his book, he records a lot of these angry men, and he says it's not that he agrees with their right-wing positions, but he said it is useless to simply condemn rather than trying to enter the emotional reality that these people are living, which is one of genuine feeling, genuine shame, and what is the swiftest route out of shame? Rage. To get angry at the object. So I think understanding the emotional reality is extremely important. It is a way into the narrative. Empathy. I mean, as I said, we've all felt shame. And okay, give you an example. My grandparents, my paternal grandparents, were ruined by the Depression in the United States. They're both dead now. My grandmother had a second-grade education. She went to school for 2 years. My grandfather got through the 4th grade. During the Depression, they lost 40 acres of their tiny little farm. They had 20 acres left. They couldn't farm it. They were devastated. They were lefty people, okay? They were kind of populist left. But what were their prejudices? They were against bankers and city slickers. I don't know if you know what that means. Fancy city people, snobs, right? Now, my grandmother, had she lived, you know, and she died at 98, had she lived, you know, through the Trump era, I can imagine my grandmother with those prejudices saying, yeah, give it to those fancy city people. And so that's my own family, and I love my grandmother. She was an irrational being, but I loved her. And I think this, for me, is what fiction can do, too, right? Fiction is a way into the particularity, the deep, what I call emotional truths of human stories.
If I may add something, I think I agree with you. These are probably old compasses in politics that fall short of describing what's going on at the moment, which doesn't imply that everything is equal, that everybody has the same project about society, about our countries. It is not like that. No matter what the tags are, people are different and they have different views, they have different plans, they have different projects. That said, I think that what is turning many people in many countries in Europe, certainly I don't want to speak of something I don't know. I speak about the thing I know, the country where I spend most of my time, my own country, Italy. I have the feeling that what drives this diffuse rage, there are radio broadcasts where you systematically, they probably select the angriest one, but nevertheless, rage is all over the place. And part of this rage, if not the majority of this rage, stems from the feeling that more and more people think of themselves as there is no narrative for them. They don't feel they are narrated, and therefore they feel they are nobody. They have no mirror, no narrative mirror in which recognize, and if someone brings that mirror, telling them, I am like you, I know what you feel, and I will bring forward your issues, even if there are no issues, or these issues are implanted in their consciousness, this is going to grow and grow and grow and grow more and more. This is my prediction in my country. I don't dare to make prediction about Germany or France or the United States. But this is the feeling I have. So without narrative, we are lost. So people need a narrative to identify themselves and go towards the people that provide possibly also the easiest narrative to be grabbed. This is the way I see things.
But isn't it interesting that both in France and in Italy, they just changed the names? The right changed the names, which is changing the narrative in a way.
Yes, the Northern League is the league.
Yeah.
It's not Northern anymore.
Yeah. It's
they were saying, Vesuvio, come on, Etna, burn all these southern bastards. They don't tell it anymore. It's wiped out.
Right.
And when journalists bring up this video footage, they say, but that was 3 years ago. And people don't bother, apparently.
Yeah. Well, D.W. Winnicott said a very beautiful thing. He was talking about patience, but he said, people need to be seen. And this goes back to our infancies, and narrative becomes part of that. And William James, another writer I love, in his chapter on the self, talks about there is nothing more terrible, as he says, than to be cut dead by another, which is not being seen. We need that exchange. We, human beings, more than any other animal, need that gleam of recognition. You exist because our existence is in part dependent on the other.
The thing that the left, pardon me if I still use this old-fashioned, but just so that we can understand each other. So one narrative that I think it's right, that our cities are populated by the so-called invisibles. And when we think about the invisible, normally we think about people immigrating from legally or most of the time illegally from other countries. The point is that we forget, many people tend to forget, there are many people who are born in Europe, in our countries, that have the same feeling. They are invisible. Nobody cares about them. Nobody speaks about them. They are helpless. They play no role in taking any decision. And this feeling of losing their identity produced the rage Siri was talking about. Sorry.
Is there someone? No?
Well,
No,
hello.
maybe it's time to wrap it up.
I have actually two questions.
Oh, sorry.
Well, you probably can't really see me. I have a question, like I said, two. First, about languages. You mentioned in the beginning it's really important to have a language, and it does shape our reality. But what you didn't mention yet are the differences in languages. But I don't just mean, French and English, but the differences in the viewpoint. There are I think languages have this is left for me, this is right for me, because I'm using myself as the basis of my viewpoint, and the environment around me is decided by how I am standing in this. But there are languages, they said, well, that's south from us, or that's north from us. How do you think, does this change the art? If you change the fundamental way you use your language? That's the first question. And the second question is about emotion, because you also mentioned that... Oh. Is it? Yes, it's on again. Okay. The second question is about emotion, where when you read that it's a real emotion, that it's not a fake, but you cry when the character cries, or you cry when they you laugh. Okay. And so the second question is about there are many thrillers and criminal stories out there, and I read in an article, don't ask me which article, it's a long time ago, that mentioned that the first kind of stories, like in the 1900s or 1800s, about criminals, about murder, they didn't really describe how gruesome it is, because the people already knew how it is, because they had more contact with a real body. And nowadays you get real gruesome, real frightening stories. How would you say, what is the meaning behind it? Would you say it's because people nowadays, they aren't in such a dangerous environment, so they want to feel how it is? That's the two questions.
No, it depends on where you live, right? So there are neighborhoods not so far from me in New York where people experience levels of violence that I don't as a middle-class white person. So I think that varies. The first question about language is fascinating, and we all know, anyone who speaks two languages, and since you're here listening to English, you have at least two, maybe more, know that there are words in German, for example, that we do not have in English. One of my favorites is Weltschmerz, which is beautiful, but there are many others. I speak Norwegian as well, and in Norwegian there are words that it's a very word-poor language, but there are words that describe aspects of human life and encounters that don't exist in English, a very word-rich language. So yes, probably the more languages you know, the more able you are to articulate subtleties about human experience.
So I guess it's time to thank you for your patience, to thank you for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks. Well, and have a good night.
Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Little gesture for you, Vittorio. And Einstein sagt Danke.